The smell of wet pine needles and her own blood was the last thing Ilara registered before her knees gave out on the frost-hardened ground. The fur bundle in her arms shifted, and a thin, reedy cry split the November air so weak it sounded more like a kitten than a wolf pup. She curled her body around the infant, pressing him against the hollow of her ribs, where her heartbeat was still strong, even if the rest of her was failing, and the border stones of the Blackmore territory cut into her shins through the threadbare wool of her dress. Somewhere behind her, maybe 2 miles back through the birch forest, the hunters from the Greymarch pack were still tracking her scent. She could feel the vibration of their paws through the frozen earth. She did not know that the Alpha King of Blackmore was standing 60 yards away downwind, watching her from the shadow of an ancient oak. She did not know that in approximately 90 seconds, everything about her life, her identity, and the screaming child in her arms would change permanently. But right now all she knew was cold. Not the poetic kind. The kind that turns your fingers into clumsy wooden pegs. The kind that makes your jaw lock so tight your molars ache. Ilara had been running for 3 days, and she had eaten once a handful of dried rose hips she found clinging to a bush near a creek bed, and they had tasted like dust and acid on her empty stomach. The pup had fared slightly better. She had bartered her only pair of boots for goat milk at a farmstead 2 days ago, and she had been feeding him drops from a soaked rag torn from her undershirt. Her feet were wrapped in strips of burlap now, and the left one had gone numb sometime around dawn. The pup cried again. His name was Fen. He was 9 days old. His mother Sarah had been Ilara's only friend in the Greymarch pack, and Sarah had died in a back room of the pack healer's cottage, while the healer was attending the beta's wife's sprained ankle instead. Ilara had been the one holding Sarah's hand when the hemorrhaging started. She had been the one pressing towels between Sarah's legs, while Sarah's eyes went glassy and her grip softened into nothing. Sarah had been a ranked wolf, a Gamma's daughter, and even she had not mattered enough. Ilara was far less than that. She was the pack's assistant record keeper, the woman who spent her days in a windowless closet adjacent to the Alpha's office, cataloguing breeding records and territory tax ledgers in a hand so small and neat it was practically invisible. She had held that position for 6 years. In that time, exactly 2 people had ever asked her name. One was Sarah. The other was the pack's elderly cook, Mrs. Harlan, who had died the previous winter. When Sarah died, and the Greymarch Alpha, a man named Torsten, who smelled perpetually of boot polish and stale mead, declared that the orphaned pup would be given to the pack's communal nursery, which was really just a room where unwanted pups languished until they were old enough to work. Ilara had done the most reckless thing of her 23 years. She had walked into the nursery at 2 in the morning, wrapped Fen in his dead mother's fur-lined cloak, and walked out the eastern gate while the border patrol was changing shifts. That had been 72 hours ago. She was going to die here. She understood this with the calm, detached clarity that extreme cold brings. Her body was shutting down in an orderly fashion, feet first, then hands, then the deep shivering that meant her core temperature was dropping. The pup would die shortly after, unless someone found him. She shifted him higher on her chest, tucking him against her throat, where the blood still ran warm, and she whispered into the top of his head, "I am sorry, little one." I tried. The voice that answered was not the wind. It was low and rough, like gravel dragged across slate, and it came from directly above her, which was impossible because she had not heard anyone approach. The voice said one word, "Mine." Ilara's eyes snapped open. She had not realized she had closed them. The world was a smear of grey and white, and the dark vertical lines of birch trunks, and then filling her entire field of vision, a man. No, not a man. Men did not look like this. He was enormous in a way that had nothing to do with simple height, though he was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that blocked out the pewter sky behind him. He was wearing a black wool coat that fell to his knees, open at the throat, despite the cold, and beneath it she could see the edge of a scarred collarbone and the heavy silver chain of office that marked him as Alpha. His hair was black and cropped close to his skull, and his jaw was the kind of jaw that looked like it had been broken and reset at least once. A scar ran from his left temple, down past his ear, disappearing into the collar of his coat. But his eyes were the color of raw amber held up to firelight, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach drop. He crouched. The motion was fluid, predatory, controlled. He was close enough now that she could smell him, and the smell hit her like a fist to the chest. Cedar smoke and iron and something, underneath, something warm and alive that made every nerve in her frozen body suddenly violently wake up. Her wolf, the wolf, she had been told her entire life was too weak to matter. The wolf that had never once surfaced during a shift stirred in the basement of her consciousness, like something turning over in deep water. The man's nostrils flared. His pupils dilated until the amber was just a thin ring around black. He said it again, quieter this time, almost to himself. Mine. And then the pup in her arms let out a wail, and the man's gaze dropped to the fur bundle, and something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, more like a recalculation. His eyes moved from the pup to Elara's face, cataloguing the cracked lips, the bruise on her cheekbone where Torsten's beta had struck her 2 weeks ago, for filing a breeding record late, the hollows under her eyes, the frost on her lashes. Who did this to you? It was not a question. His voice made it a statement, a verdict, a sentence already passed. Elara opened her mouth to answer, and found that her jaw would not cooperate. The cold had locked it shut. She made a sound that was not a word. He shrugged off his coat in one motion and wrapped it around her, and the pup together, and the residual heat from his body was so shocking against her frozen skin that she gasped. He gathered her up, one arm beneath her knees, one behind her shoulders, and stood in a single motion, as if she weighed nothing. She probably didn't weigh much. She had lost 11 pounds in the last month, alone. The pup, the Alpha King of Blackmoor, said to the man who had materialized silently beside him, a lean, scarred warrior with a shaved head and watchful eyes. Healer. Now. The warrior looked at Elara, then at the bundle, then at his Alpha. He did not argue. He turned and ran. The Alpha King carried her across the border. She could feel his heartbeat through the layers of wool and linen, steady and slow, a drumbeat that did not speed up, even as he moved at a pace that should have been a jog. She was pressed against his chest, and the cedar and iron smell was everywhere, saturating the coat, his skin, the air between them. Her wolf was doing something it had never done before. It was pressing forward, pushing against the inside of her ribs, straining toward this man with a single-minded desperation that Elara could not understand and could not stop. He looked down at her once as he walked. The amber eyes were unreadable, but his arm tightened around her shoulders, pulling her closer, and when he spoke, his voice was different. Lower. Private. You are on my land now. No one touches what is on my land. Elara's last coherent thought, before the warmth dragged her under, was that she should be afraid. She was in the arms of Cale Blackmoor, the Alpha King, the man they called the Fang of the North, whose reputation for ruthlessness was so thorough that even Torsten, who feared nothing, lowered his eyes when Kyle's name came up at council meetings. She should be terrified, but her wolf was purring a low subsonic vibration in her chest that she had never felt before, and the pup had gone quiet against her heart, and the cold was retreating inch by inch, and the last thing she saw before her eyes closed was the sharp line of his jaw and the way his throat moved when he swallowed as if he too was struggling with something he could not name. She woke in a room that smelled like beeswax and dried lavender. The ceiling was made of dark timber beams, and firelight was moving across it in slow orange waves. She was lying in a bed so soft that for a disoriented moment she thought she was floating. The sheets were linen, real linen, not the coarse hemp she was accustomed to, and someone had dressed her in a nightgown that was too large for her, but clean and warm and smelled faintly of cedar. The pup. She sat upright so fast that her vision went grey at the edges. Her hands went to her chest, her stomach, the empty space beside her on the mattress. "He is here." The voice came from the corner of the room. Kyle Blackmore was sitting in a wooden chair that looked too small for him, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped between them. In the firelight, the scar on his temple looked deeper, and his eyes had the slightly bloodshot quality of someone who had not slept. Beside him, on a low table, padded with folded blankets, was Fen asleep, his tiny fist curled around the edge of the fur cloak that Alara had wrapped him in. The pack healer examined him, Kyle said. "Malnourished, early signs of exposure. But he will live." He paused, studying her face. "My healer said the same about you." "Barely." Alara's throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. She swallowed twice before she could speak. "Thank you. I will leave as soon as I can walk. I do not want to cause trouble for your pack. I just needed him to be safe." Kyle did not move. His expression did not change. But something in the quality of his stillness shifted the way the air changes pressure before a storm. "You are not leaving." Alara blinked. I am sorry. I am not part of your pack. I am nobody. I have no rank, no wolf worth mentioning, no claim to hospitality. If the Greymarch Alpha finds out you sheltered me, it could cause a territorial dispute, and I am not worth that. I will take the pup and go south. There are human settlements that might— "You are not leaving," he repeated, and this time his voice carried the subsonic resonance of an alpha command, a frequency that vibrated in her bone marrow and made her wolf press flat against the floor of her consciousness in automatic submission. Not fear. Something older than fear. Recognition. He stood and the chair scraped against the stone floor, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and stood at the foot of her bed, and he was so large that he blocked the firelight and cast her in shadow. "Do you know what you smell like to me?" he said. She shook her head, like the first snow on warm ground, like the inside of a beehive in August. He stopped. His jaw worked. He looked away from her for the first time, and in the amber of his eyes, she saw something she had not expected. Uncertainty. "I have waited 11 years for that scent. My wolf has been—" he chose the word carefully— "ungovernable. For 11 years. My council thinks I am losing control. My enemies think I am weak because I have no Luna. I have fought in 14 territorial wars. I have killed more wolves than I can count. None of it has quieted the noise in my head." He looked at her again. "You quiet it. You walked onto my border, half dead, with a stranger's pup in your arms. And you quiet it." Alara stared at him. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw, the hollow of his throat, and she realized that beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the disbelief, her wolf was doing something extraordinary. It was standing up, not crouching, not cowering, not lying dormant like it had for 23 years. Standing, leaning toward this man with a pull so physical it felt like a hook behind her sternum. "I am an Omega," she said quietly. My wolf has never shifted. I cannot be what you need. Kyle's eyes darkened. You have no idea what I need. He reached down and adjusted the blanket around Fen without looking, a gesture so automatic and careful that Elara felt something crack in her chest. This massive, scarred, terrifying man tucking a dead woman's pup in tighter while arguing about fate. She watched his hand, the knuckles white with old scars, the fingers broad but precise, and she understood in that moment that he had already decided. About her, about Fen, about all of it. What is the pup's name? He asked. Fen. His mother was my friend. She died. His father is unknown. In the pack records, his father was listed as... I did not ask about records. Kyle straightened. I asked his name. Fen. He tested the syllable. It sounded different in his voice. Heavier. More permanent. And yours? Elara. He nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. Then he turned and walked to the door, and before he stepped through it, he said, without looking back, My healer will bring food. Eat all of it. You are too thin, and my wolf does not like it. The door closed behind him. Elara sat in the enormous bed in the firelit room with the timber ceiling and the linen sheets, and she pressed her hand to the center of her chest where her wolf was doing something it had never done before, and she tried to remember the last time someone had told her to eat. She could not. Over the following days, the geography of Elara's life rearranged itself so thoroughly that she sometimes caught herself looking for the seams, the places where the illusion would peel back and reveal the familiar architecture of neglect underneath. The room she had woken in was not a guest chamber, she learned. It was a suite in the Alpha's own wing of the Blackmoor Keep, separated from Cale's quarters by a single corridor. His head of household, a brisk, silver-haired woman named Bridget, who smelled like rosemary and moved with the efficiency of someone who had managed wolves for 40 years, appeared 3 times a day with trays of food, not ceremonial food, specific food, bone broth with marrow, because Elara's stomach could not yet handle solids, soft bread with butter and honey, roasted root vegetables mashed to a paste, warm goat milk for Fen, delivered in a clay vessel with a linen nipple that Bridget had clearly fashioned herself. Elara ate. She ate because she was starving, and because every time she left food on the tray, Bridget's mouth would tighten into a line, and she would say something like, The Alpha asked me to report whether you finished, and Elara did not want to think about what would happen if she did not. On the 3rd day, she was strong enough to walk to the window. The view stole her breath. Blackmoor was not a pack compound. It was a fortress carved into the side of a granite mountain overlooking a valley of black pines and silver rivers, and the November light hit the frost on the pine needles and turned the whole landscape into a field of broken glass. In Greymarch she had worked in a closet. Here the window of her room was 6 feet wide, and the glass was real, not oiled parchment, and the fireplace was large enough to stand in. She was staring at the valley when the door opened without a knock. Not Bridget. Kyle. He was dressed differently today. Less formal. A dark grey tunic with the sleeves pushed up, revealing forearms roped with muscle and scar tissue, and loose trousers tucked into worn boots. He looked, she thought, irrationally, like someone who had been doing physical work. Chopping wood, maybe. Or killing something. He was carrying Fen. The sight was so incongruous that Elara's brain short-circuited. The Alpha King of Blackmoor, the Fang of the North, holding a 9-day-old pup against his chest, with one hand spread across the infant's entire back, the baby's face tucked into the hollow of his throat. Fen was asleep, His tiny fingers were curled around a fistful of Kyle's tunic. "Your pup," Kyle said, as if this required explanation, woke up. Bridget was occupied. He paused. He prefers to be held against a heartbeat. "I have discovered this." Elara crossed the room and reached for Fen, and her fingers brushed Kyle's chest in the transfer, and the contact sent a jolt of heat up her arm so violent that she nearly dropped the baby. Kyle's hand shot out and steadied hers, wrapping around her wrist. And for a moment they stood like that, the pup between them, his hand on her skin, the fire popping in the grate. "Your heart rate just doubled," he observed. "So did yours." His mouth twitched. It was not a smile, but it was close. He released her wrist slowly, his thumb dragging across her pulse point, and the sensation lingered on her skin like a burn. "There is something you should know," he said, stepping back. "The Greymarch Alpha has sent a formal request for your return. He claims you stole pack property." The pup. Elara's blood went cold. "Fen is not property. He is a child. A child nobody wanted. I am aware." Kyle's voice was flat. "I have denied the request. Torsten will not be pleased. He will retaliate." Elara's voice came out thin. "You do not know him. He does not care about Fen. He cares about the insult, about an Omega defying him in front of his pack." "I know exactly who Torsten is," Kale said. "I fought beside him at the Ashfall border 3 years ago. He abandoned his left flank to protect his own retreat and let 19 wolves die." He turned toward the window, and the light caught the scar on his temple, and Elara realized it continued behind his ear, down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. A claw mark. Deep. Old. "I know what he is," Kyle continued, "and I am telling you that he will not set foot on my land. Not for you. Not for the pup. Not for anything." There was a silence. Fen murmured in his sleep a small, wet sound. "Why are you doing this?" Elara asked. The honest question she had been afraid to voice. "You do not know me. The mate bond it is biology. It is not a reason to start a territorial conflict." Kyle turned back to her. His amber eyes were steady. "You catalogued breeding records in Greymarch?" "Yes." He saw her surprise. "I have been reading your file. 6 years of meticulous records. Not a single error. You reorganized their entire tax ledger system in your 2nd year. Their trade efficiency with the northern human settlements increased by 14% because of documentation changes you implemented. You did this from a closet. Without credit. Without rank. Without anyone knowing your name." Elara said nothing. "I am not doing this because of biology," Kyle said. "I am doing this because someone who does that kind of work in those conditions is not nobody. And I am doing this because my wolf will tear this mountain apart if I let you walk out that door, and I am tired of fighting him." He left before she could respond. The door closed quietly. Elara stood in the firelight with Fen against her chest, and her wolf singing a note so high and clear that she could feel it in her teeth. That night she could not sleep. She lay in the too-soft bed and listened to the wind against the windows and the distant sound of wolves running patrol in the valley below, their howls threading through the night like silver wire. Fen slept in the cradle beside her bed, a proper cradle that had appeared that afternoon, carved from dark oak with wool padding and a mobile of small wooden wolves hanging above it that turned slowly in the heat from the fireplace. Bridget had brought it without comment. Elara stared at the ceiling and thought about what Kyle had said. She thought about the closet in Greymarch, the way the single overhead light buzzed and flickered, the way her back ached from hunching over the ledgers on a desk that was really just a repurposed shelf. She thought about how every year during the pack census, she would see the birth records of pups born to ranked wolves, the careful entries noting parentage and bloodline, and expected shift date, and then the thin, perfunctory entries for omega pups just a number, and a date and a dash where the father's name should be. She thought about how her own entry looked exactly like that. She thought about Sarah, who had been the only person in Greymarch who ever sat in the closet with her and talked about something other than records. Sarah, who brought her tea on cold mornings, and who once, when a pack warrior had knocked Ilara's lunch tray out of her hands in the dining hall and laughed about it, had stood up and said nothing, but had simply picked up the tray and carried it back to the kitchen and brought Ilara a fresh plate. It was such a small thing, such a small, unremarkable thing, but Ilara had carried it with her like a stone in her pocket for 3 years, the weight of being seen by one person in a world that did not bother to look. Sarah was dead. Fen was here, and the Alpha King of Blackmoor was sleeping 60 feet down the corridor, and he smelled like cedar and iron and the inside of a beehive in August, and Ilara's wolf was standing up inside her for the first time in her life, and she did not know what any of it meant. She slept eventually. In the morning there was porridge with cream and fresh bread on the tray, and a small jar of wildflower honey with a handwritten label in a script she did not recognize. By the end of the first week, Ilara had mapped enough of Blackmoor's keep to understand that it was not just large, but alive. The corridors hummed with purpose. Wolves moved through them with a briskness that spoke of training and discipline, not the sullen obedience she was used to in Greymarch. The kitchens, which she discovered on an exploratory walk with Fen, strapped to her chest in a cloth sling that Bridget had provided, were enormous and staffed by a rotating crew of wolves who actually seemed to enjoy the work. The head cook, a barrel-chested man named Ronan, with flour in his beard and a laugh that rattled the copper pots hanging from the ceiling, gave her a taste of the venison stew he was preparing. And then, when she suggested that a handful of juniper berries might cut through the richness, stared at her for a long moment before declaring her the first person in this whole bloody fortress who understands what a pot needs. She liked Ronan. She liked Bridget. She liked the way the keep smelled smoke and stone and pine resin, and she liked the way the wolves she passed in the corridors dipped their heads slightly in her direction, not with the exaggerated deference reserved for ranked wolves, but with a quiet acknowledgement that she existed, that she was there, that she was allowed to be there. What she did not like was the way some of them looked at her when they thought she could not see. The sideways glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She was not stupid. She was an unmarked, unclaimed Omega, living in the Alpha's wing with a pup that was not hers, and the pack's gossip network was probably running at full capacity. She also did not like the woman named Lysara. Lysara was Cale's chief advisor, the daughter of his father's former beta-tall and sharp-featured, with auburn hair pulled into a severe braid, and the kind of posture that suggested she had never once been uncertain about anything. She smelled like cold metal and crushed mint, and the first time Ilara encountered her in the corridor outside Cale's council chamber, Lysara had looked at her with eyes the color of slate and said, "So you are the stray." Ilara had not responded. She had learned long ago that responding to provocation only extended it. Lysara had studied her for a moment longer, then added with a precision that was somehow worse than cruelty. He has never brought anyone into the keep before. Not once in 11 years. His wolf rejected every candidate the council presented. We assumed he was simply incapable of bonding. And then you arrive half-frozen, carrying a dead wolf's orphan, and suddenly the Alpha King of Blackmoor is attending to cradle deliveries and requesting extra honey for breakfast trays. You will forgive me if I find the timing convenient. Elara had walked away with Fen pressed against her shoulder and her hands trembling. Not because she was afraid of Lysara, because Lysara had articulated the exact fear that Elara herself could not stop turning over in the sleepless hours, the fear that this was a mistake, a cosmic miscalculation, that the mate bond had misfired and landed on the wrong woman, and eventually everyone, including Kale, would realize it. The second week brought two developments. The first was that Fen opened his eyes. They were green, not the muddy hazel green of common wolves, but a vivid, startling emerald that Elara had seen exactly once before in a painting in the Greymarch Alpha's office that she had dusted every morning for 6 years. The painting depicted the founding family of the Greymarch bloodline, the original Alphas, the Ashwood dynasty. Elara sat on the floor of her room with Fen in her lap and stared into those green eyes and felt the ground shift beneath her. Sarah had never told her who Fen's father was. In the breeding records, the entry was blank. But Sarah had been a Gamma's daughter, and Gammas did not have blank entries. Blank entries meant the father was either unknown or could not be named. Could not be named because naming him would be dangerous. Because naming him would reveal something that was supposed to stay hidden. Torsten's eyes were green, not emerald, but close. Elara pulled Fen closer and pressed her lips to the top of his head and breathed in his scent, milk and warm skin and something underneath, something loamy and deep, like turned earth after rain. He was not just an unwanted orphan. He was evidence. Evidence of a mating that Torsten, who had a Luna, who had heirs, who had a reputation to maintain, could never acknowledge. That was why Torsten wanted him back. Not because Fen was pack property, because Fen was a loose end. The second development was that Elara's wolf began to shift. It started small, a tingling in her fingertips that came and went, a sudden sharpness in her hearing that made her jump when Bridget set a tray down in the next room, an ache in her jaw behind her molars that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She dismissed it as stress. She dismissed it as the mate bond playing tricks on her system. She dismissed it until the morning she was bathing Fen in the copper tub in her room, and a bar of soap slipped from her hand, and she caught it in midair with a reflex so fast that her arm blurred. She stared at her hand. The fingers looked the same, but they felt different, stronger. Like the bones inside them had been replaced with something denser. That evening, Kyle came to her room for what had become their nightly routine, a half-hour of conversation that always began with Fen and ended somewhere unexpected. He would sit in the wooden chair, too large for it, his long legs stretched out, and she would sit on the bed with Fen between them, and they would talk about the pack, about trade routes, about the venison stew, which Ronan had indeed improved with juniper berries, about anything except the thing that hung in the air between them, like heat lightning, the bond, the scent, the way their bodies angled toward each other, without conscious direction. Tonight she did not talk about stew. "Something is happening to me," she said, "to my wolf." Kyle went very still. The amber eyes locked onto hers. "I caught a bar of soap today, before it fell. I did not decide to catch it. My hand moved on its own. And my hearing. I can hear the patrol changeover on the south wall from this room. That is a 1/4 mile away. How long? A week, maybe longer." He stood. He crossed the room. He crouched in front of her, and they were at eye level, and his scent rolled over her like a wave, cedar and iron and that warm, alive underthing that made her wolf press forward so hard she could feel it in her spine. "I need to touch you," he said. "Your wrist. I need to feel your pulse." She extended her hand. He wrapped his fingers around her wrist, and the contact was a detonation, a bloom of heat that started at the point of contact and spread up her arm and into her chest and down into her stomach and lower, and she gasped, and he sucked in a breath through his teeth, and for 3 seconds neither of them moved. "Your wolf is not dormant," he said, his voice rough. It never was. It was suppressed. Suppressed. There are herbs, old ones, rarely used. If administered to a pup before their first year, they can lock a wolf in a state of permanent dormancy. The effects look identical to a weak or absent wolf. Most healers cannot tell the difference. He paused. But when a mate bond activates it, overrides the suppression. Slowly. Like water eroding a dam. Ilara's mouth was dry. Why would anyone suppress a pup's wolf? Because, Kyle said, still holding her wrist, his thumb on her pulse, the only reason to suppress a wolf that young is if the wolf at full strength would reveal something about the pup's bloodline that someone wanted hidden. The room was very quiet. The fire crackled. Fen slept. "You think I am not what I was told?" "I am," Ilara whispered. "I think," Kyle said slowly, "that the woman who reorganized Greymarch's entire administrative system from a closet, whose wolf is now throwing off decades of chemical suppression in a matter of weeks, and whose scent matches mine so precisely that my wolf stopped raging for the first time in 11 years the moment she crossed my border, is considerably more than what she was told she is." He released her wrist. The absence of his touch was a physical ache. "Tomorrow," he said, "I am sending for a healer from the White Ridge Pack. She is the oldest living wolf healer in the Northern Territories. If anyone can identify what was used on you, she can. And if she finds something," Ilara said, "then we will know whose bloodline someone went to great lengths to erase." He left. Ilara sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands, the hands that had spent 6 years copying numbers in a closet, and she turned them over, and in the firelight she could see the faintest shimmer beneath her skin, like light refracted through water. The healer from White Ridge arrived 4 days later. Her name was Maren, and she was very old and very small, with hands like knotted rope, and eyes that were milky with cataracts, but somehow saw more than anyone Ilara had ever met. She smelled like dried sage and wood smoke, and something ancient and green like moss growing on stone in a place where the sun never reached. Maren examined Ilara in silence for 45 minutes. She pressed her fingertips to Ilara's temples, her throat, her wrists, the base of her spine. She placed both hands flat on Ilara's stomach and closed her eyes, and stood that way for so long that Ilara's legs began to ache from standing still. When Maren finally stepped back, her expression was unreadable. "Ashwood root," she said, "combined with lunar lichen, administered before the first moon after birth, the traditional suppression formula. I have not seen it used in..." She paused, counting. 30 years. It was outlawed after the purge. Kyle was standing by the door, arms crossed, radiating a contained violence that made the air in the room feel tight. "What purge?" Maren looked at him. "The one your father ordered, 24 years ago, when the last alpha of the Ashwood line was killed and his bloodline was declared extinct." She turned back to Ilara. "This woman is not an Omega. She never was. Her wolf is Alpha class, possibly higher. The suppression masked it completely, which tells me it was administered by someone who knew exactly what they were hiding." The silence in the room was absolute. Ilara felt the floor tilt beneath her. Alpha class. The words did not make sense. She was an Omega. She had always been an Omega. Her record said Omega. Her entire life had been built on the foundation of that word, the small rooms, the invisible work, the accepted cruelty, the lowered eyes. "That is not possible," she heard herself say, Child Maren said, and her voice was not unkind. The Ashwood Alphas were the oldest bloodline in the Northern Territories. When your father ordered them exterminated, she said to Cale, some of the infants were hidden, smuggled into other packs, given new names, new histories, suppressed. My father, Cale said, carefully, believed the Ashwood line threatened his claim. Your father was correct. Maren's gaze moved between them. The Ashwood bloodline predates every pack in the north, including Blackmore. She looked at Elara with those milky, seeing eyes. You are not just Alpha class, child. You are the last living Ashwood. And that pup you are carrying. She nodded toward the cradle where Fen slept. That pup's father knew exactly whose grandchild he was siring, and he knew exactly why the mother had to die before anyone discovered it. The room erupted. Not physically. No one moved, but the quality of the air changed the way it changes at the center of a storm where everything is still but charged. Kyle's wolf surged forward so violently that his eyes shifted, the amber flooding with gold, his pupils narrowing to vertical slits, and the alpha command that rolled off him was so powerful that Elara's knees buckled. But she didn't go down. For the first time in her life, her wolf pushed back. Not against Cale, against the command itself. She felt it rise in her like a column of hot air, and her spine straightened, and she stood there, an Omega in a borrowed nightgown, and she held the gaze of the Alpha King of Blackmore while his wolf raged. His eyes widened. Then slowly the gold receded. The amber returned. And something moved across his face that Elara would later identify as awe. You just resisted a full Alpha command, he said. Maren was smiling. A thin, ancient smile. Ashwood wolves, she murmured, were always stubborn. The days that followed were the hinge of Elara's existence. Maren stayed in the keep, administering a regimen of herbs designed to safely reverse the suppression, and each day Elara's wolf grew stronger. Her senses sharpened until the world became almost painfully vivid. She could hear conversations 2 floors below her. She could smell the difference between Brigid's morning rosemary and the wild rosemary that grew on the eastern slope of the mountain. Her body changed too. The hollows in her face filled out, and her muscles developed a density that had nothing to do with the food, though Ronan had taken to preparing her increasingly elaborate meals and watching anxiously while she ate. Her skin lost its ashen quality and took on a warm, golden undertone that Maren said was characteristic of the Ashwood bloodline. She had not yet shifted. Maren cautioned patience. A wolf suppressed for 23 years needed to emerge slowly, like a diver ascending from great depth. Too fast, and the physiological shock could be fatal. But the wolf was there. Elara could feel it now, not as a vague stirring, but as a presence, a second consciousness that shared her body with an intelligence and a fierceness that made her throat tight with something she had never felt before. Pride. Meanwhile, the political situation deteriorated. Torsten had sent 3 more formal requests for Elara and Fenn's return, each more aggressive than the last. The third one contained a thinly veiled threat of military action. Kyle had responded to each with a single word: no. His council was divided. Lysara argued that an Omega and an orphaned pup were not worth a war. Several council members agreed. Others who had scented the bond between Kyle and Elara, even if it remained unclaimed, argued that the Alpha's mate was worth any cost. Elara attended the council meeting uninvited, She walked through the doors of the council chamber with Fen in the sling on her chest, and every head turned, and Lysara's mouth opened, and then closed, and Kyle, seated at the head of a massive stone table, looked at her with an expression that was half warning and half something she could not decipher. "I have something to say," Ilara said. The room waited. "I know why Torsten wants the pup back." She stood straight. Her wolf was a warm pressure behind her ribs. "Fen is Torsten's son. His illegitimate son, conceived with a Gamma's daughter, he had no right to touch. He had her killed to keep it secret. He will have Fen killed for the same reason. That is why I ran. Not because I am defiant, not because I want to cause a war, because a 9-day-old child was going to die in a room where no one cared enough to check on him." Silence. Lysara spoke first. "You have proof." Ilara looked at her. His eyes are ashwood green, the same shade that appears in the founding portraits of the Greymarch Alpha line. Torsten's grandmother was a minor ashwood. The trait breeds true in males. "Look at him." She shifted the sling slightly, and Fen, who had been watching the proceedings with the solemn intensity of a much older child, blinked his vivid green eyes at the council. It was Lysara who broke the silence. Lysara who had called her a stray. Lysara who had questioned her presence with surgical precision. Lysara looked at those green eyes, and her face did something complicated, and she turned to Kyle and said, in a voice stripped of its usual sharpness, "If this is true, the pup is evidence of a mating violation and a murder conspiracy. Greymarch pack law requires a tribunal. Torsten cannot demand his return without admitting his involvement." She paused, and then added more quietly, "She is right. The child would not have survived the nursery." Ilara stared at her. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement she had received from the woman, and it arrived not as warmth, but as grudging professional respect, the recognition of one strategist for another. Kyle dismissed the council. When the room had emptied, he remained seated at the stone table, his hands flat on its surface, and Ilara stood on the other side, and the space between them felt like a living thing. "That was reckless," he said. "That was necessary," she said. "You walked into a room full of wolves who do not know you and made a political accusation against a sitting alpha. If you are wrong, I am not wrong." She held his gaze. "I spent 6 years reading every breeding record, every tax ledger, every mating certificate in Greymarch. I know that Pack's secrets better than Torsten does. He has been falsifying pedigree records for at least 4 years to cover unauthorized matings. Sarah was not the first. She was just the first who produced a pup." Kyle stared at her for a long time. Then he stood, walked around the table and stopped an arm's length from her. The cedar and iron scent was thick, and her wolf was pressing so hard against her ribs that she could feel it as a physical ache. "You are not an Omega," he said. "No. You are Ashwood." "Yes." His hand came up and hovered near her face, not touching fingers an inch from her jaw. She could feel the heat radiating from his palm. "I want to mark you," he said. The honesty in his voice was startling. "Bare. Unguarded. My wolf wants to mark you so badly that I have not slept in 4 nights. Every time I leave your room, I have to stand in the corridor and physically restrain myself from going back in. I bit through my own lip 2 nights ago." She looked and saw the faint cut on his lower lip nearly healed. His body repaired fast. But he continued, and his hand dropped. "I will not mark an unwilling mate. The bond does not make you mine. Your consent makes you mine. And you have been owned by a pack that did not deserve you for 23 years, and I will not be the next person who takes from you without asking." Ilara felt her eyes burn. Not because of what he said, because of the way his hand trembled when he pulled it back. This man who had fought 14 wars and killed more wolves than he could count trembling because he would not touch her without permission. She reached out and caught his retreating hand and pressed his palm flat against her jaw. His whole body went rigid. A sound came out of him that was not entirely human, low and rough and broken, and his fingers curled around the back of her neck, and his forehead dropped to hers, and they stood like that, breathing each other's air, his thumb moving slowly across the hinge of her jaw. "Not yet," she whispered. "Not because I do not want it. Because I need to know who I am first, before I become someone's, even yours." He pulled back enough to look at her. His eyes were liquid gold. "Then I will wait," he said. "I have waited 11 years. I can wait for you." She almost kissed him then. Her body wanted to. Her wolf was screaming for it. But she held and he held, and the restraint between them was more intimate than any kiss could have been. He left. His scent stayed. 2 weeks later, Torsten came. He did not send messengers this time. He came himself with 40 wolves at his back, and they halted a mile from Blackmoor's border, in a show of force that Elara watched from the keep's highest tower, with Fen in her arms, and her wolf pacing behind her ribs like a caged thing. She had not expected to feel fear. She had expected the old, familiar numbness that Greymarch had taught her, the blankness that came from a lifetime of being too small to fight back. But she was not small anymore. Her wolf was awake, not fully emerged, but present, and it did not know how to be numb. It knew how to be angry. Kyle met Torsten on the open field between the border stones. Elara watched from the tower. Brigid stood beside her, silent, her hand resting on the windowsill. Torsten was a tall man, broad but soft around the middle, with thinning brown hair, and those pale green eyes that looked like a diluted version of Fen's. He wore formal leathers and a ceremonial cloak with the Greymarch crest, a grey wolf rampant on a field of black, and from this distance Elara could see the way he stood, weight shifted back, chin slightly raised, the posture of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed and confused by any situation that did not cooperate. She could not hear their words from this distance, but she could see their bodies. Kyle stood with his feet planted and his arms at his sides perfectly still, and the wolves behind Torsten shifted and paced, and the wolves behind Kyle, a line of 20 that included his shaved-headed second-in-command, stood just as still as their alpha. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Elara counted. Then Torsten turned and walked back to his wolves, and Kyle turned and walked back to the keep, and nothing had exploded or died, and Elara released a breath she had been holding for so long that her ribs ached. Kyle appeared in her room 40 minutes later. His face was carved from granite. His eyes were gold, not amber, and she could see the wolf in them, churning, barely leashed. "He wants a tribunal," Kyle said. "Before the Northern Council. He is claiming I have stolen a registered pack member and a pack-born pup. He is requesting your forcible return, pending investigation." Elara's stomach dropped. "And the Northern Council has agreed to hear the case in 3 days, at the neutral ground at Herondale. Then I will testify." Kyle's jaw clenched. "If Torsten proves his claim, the Council can order your return to Greymarch, under his authority." "Then I will testify," she repeated, "and I will bring the records." "What records?" She looked at him. For the first time since he had met her, she allowed a small, hard smile. "I copied the Greymarch breeding ledgers. All of them. Every entry from the last 10 years. I kept them in a false bottom in my desk in the closet because I noticed discrepancies in the 3rd year, and I did not know what they meant, but I knew they mattered." She paused. I have the original documents that show Torsten's falsified pedigree records, including the entry for Sarah's pregnancy, including the entry that was altered after her death. Kyle stared at her. I told you, she said. I was a very good record keeper. He crossed the room in 2 strides and kissed her. It was not gentle. It was the kind of kiss that begins with collision, his mouth on hers, his hands on the sides of her face, his body crowding hers against the window frame so that the cold glass pressed against her back and his heat pressed against her front, and the contrast made her gasp into his mouth. He kissed like he fought with total commitment and zero hesitation, and her wolf surged so hard that she felt her canines extend for the first time, sharp and strange, against the inside of her lip. And he felt it too, because he pulled back just enough to look at her mouth, and his eyes went fully gold. Your wolf, he breathed. I know. Tell me to stop. No. He kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. And when they finally separated, they were both breathing hard, and his hand was still on her face, and her fingers were twisted in the front of his tunic, and somewhere in the room, Fen made a small, contented sound in his sleep. 3 days, Kyle said. 3 days, she agreed. He pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture so tender it made her chest ache, and left. The Herondale Tribunal grounds were a natural amphitheater of grey stone at the confluence of 2 rivers, and when Ilara arrived, walking between Cale and his second-in-command, the November wind cut through the valley like a blade, and the stone seats were filled with wolves from 12 northern packs. The Northern Council sat at the centre, on a raised platform, 7 alpha-ranked wolves from the most powerful packs, old and scarred, and radiating the combined authority of centuries of bloodline politics. Torsten was already there. He stood on the eastern side of the amphitheater with his wolves behind him, and when he saw Ilara, something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Fear. Quick and swiftly buried, but she saw it. She was not the same woman who had left his pack 3 weeks ago. She knew this. She had seen it in the mirror that morning, the color in her face, the density of her muscles, the way she held her spine straight and tall, her wolf, a visible presence behind her eyes. She was still thin. She was still scarred, but she was no longer invisible. Fen was in Brigid's arms, safely in the Blackmore delegation. Ilara had insisted on standing before the council without him. She needed her hands free. She needed to be seen not as a mother, but as a witness. Torsten spoke first. He presented his case with the practiced confidence of a man who had won tribunals before. The Omega Ilara, unranked, unregistered for mating, had stolen a pack-born pup and fled to Blackmore. The Alpha of Blackmore, influenced by an alleged bond that had not been verified by any healer, had refused lawful return. This was a violation of Northern Pack Accords, Section 14, Subsection 3, the unrestricted right of an Alpha to claim jurisdiction over pack-born members and pups. He spoke for 20 minutes. He was polished, persuasive. He made eye contact with each council member. He referenced law and precedent and the sanctity of pack structure. He did not mention Sarah. He did not mention Fen's parentage. He did not mention why an Alpha would pursue a single Omega and an unremarkable pup with such ferocity. When it was Ilara's turn, she stood in the center of the amphitheater, and the wind tore at her dress, and 7 Alphas looked down at her, with expressions ranging from boredom to mild curiosity, and she was afraid. But her wolf was not. She spoke for 12 minutes. She told them about Sarah. She told them about the hemorrhaging and the healer who was not there, and the death that didn't have to happen. She told them about the nursery, the room where unwanted pups were stored like surplus grain, the ones who didn't survive their first winter, the ones who disappeared from the records without explanation. Then she produced the breeding ledger copies. She had sewn them into the lining of Sarah's fur cloak, the one she had wrapped Fen in the night she fled. The pages were thin, tissue-fine, covered in her small, meticulous handwriting, and she unfolded them on the stone floor of the amphitheatre and walked the council through 10 years of falsified records. She showed them the entries that had been altered, the dates that didn't match, the pregnancy that was recorded as a common mating, and then, after Sarah's death, reclassified as a surrogate arrangement with no father listed. She showed them Fen's original entry, the one Torsten had not known she copied before it was altered, the one that listed the father's contribution as alpha line, verified by scent match. The amphitheatre was silent. Then Torsten laughed. It came out forced harsh, echoing off the stone. This is a fabrication. She was a record keeper. She had access to the originals. She could have manufactured any discrepancy she wanted. Elara did not look at him. She looked at the council. "I request a scent verification," she said. "A healer can confirm the pup's paternal lineage with a standard bloodline scent match. It takes 10 minutes. If I am lying, the test will show it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elara had ever heard. Torsten's face went white, not red. White. The blood drained from his cheeks so quickly that for a moment he looked almost ghostly, and his mouth opened and closed once, and in that fraction of a second, Elara saw something she did not expect. She saw exhaustion, not the physical kind, the deep, bone-level exhaustion of a man who has been maintaining a lie so long that it has become the architecture of his entire life, and the walls are cracking, and he can hear them cracking, and he is so tired of holding them up that part of him, a small buried part, is almost relieved that someone has finally brought a hammer. It passed in an instant. His face hardened, his chin lifted. "I withdraw my claim," Torsten said. His voice was flat. "The pup is not of sufficient value to warrant continued dispute." But it was too late. The council had heard the request. The oldest member, a white-haired alpha from the Stonefall pack, leaned forward and said in a voice like rustling parchment, "The request for verification has been entered into record. It cannot be withdrawn by the opposing party." She looked at Torsten with the dispassionate assessment of someone who had judged wolves for 50 years. "The test will proceed." It proceeded. Maren, who had travelled with the Blackmore delegation, performed the verification in front of the full council. She held Fen in her ancient hands and breathed his scent long and slow, and then she walked to where Torsten stood and breathed his scent, and then she returned to the council platform and said in a voice that carried across the entire amphitheatre, "Paternal match confirmed. The pup carries the alpha line of Greymarch." The eruption was not silent this time. Voices rose from every section of the amphitheatre. Torsten's wolves shifted uneasily. 2 of them stepped away from their alpha, a physical severing that spoke louder than any words. But Maren was not finished. She turned to Elara and said with the calm precision of someone delivering a diagnosis they have been carrying for weeks, "There is another matter. This woman carries a bloodline that I have verified through direct examination. She is a full-blooded Ashwood alpha, the last of her line. Her wolf was chemically suppressed at birth, which is a violation of the lunar accords of the Fourth Age. The party responsible for the suppression would have required access to the prohibited herbs and knowledge of the Ashwood line's continued existence." She looked at Torsten. Greymarch was the pack tasked with executing the Ashwood Purge 24 years ago. The Alpha of Greymarch at that time reported all bloodline members eliminated. She paused. Clearly he lied. And there it was. The whole ugly architecture of it laid bare on the cold stone of the amphitheatre. Torsten's father had been ordered to eliminate the Ashwood line. Instead, he had hidden at least one infant, suppressed her wolf, and buried her in the records as a common Omega. Torsten had inherited the secret and the prisoner. He had kept Ilara in a closet for 6 years, cataloguing the very records that contained the evidence of her own erasure, and she had never known. Until now. The council deliberated for 40 minutes. The verdict was unanimous. Torsten was stripped of his alpha title, pending a full investigation into the Ashwood Purge violations, the falsified breeding records, and the death of Sarah Mother of the pup Fen, now recognized as the illegitimate alpha heir of Greymarch. Custody of both Ilara and Fen was formally transferred to Blackmoor, and Cale was appointed interim overseer of Greymarch territory until a new alpha could be installed. Torsten left the amphitheatre flanked by council enforcers. As he passed Ilara, he stopped. The enforcers tensed. Kyle, 10 feet away, went very still. Torsten looked at her. His green eyes were flat. She kept the records for 23 years, he said. My father told me to destroy them. He said there was no point keeping an Ashwood alive. But she... He stopped. His jaw worked. My mother said the child might be useful someday. That was the word she used. Useful. He looked at Fen in Brigid's arms. I never wanted a pup, he said, and his voice was so quiet that only Ilara with her newly sharpened hearing could catch every word. Sarah was kind. She was kind to me when I did not deserve it, and I repaid her by letting her die in a back room while I sat in my office and did nothing. He walked away. The enforcers followed. Ilara stood in the November wind and watched him go and felt nothing clean. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Just the heavy, complicated weight of a truth that did not resolve neatly into heroes and villains. She felt Kyle's hand on the small of her back. Let us go home, he said. Home. She had never had one. The word sat in her chest like a coal, warm and glowing and slightly painful, as if the organ that was supposed to hold it had atrophied from disuse and needed to stretch. They returned to Blackmoor. That night, Ilara shifted for the first time. It happened in the courtyard of the keep, under a sky full of stars, so bright they looked like holes punched in black fabric. Maren had said it was coming. The suppression had eroded to the point where the wolf could no longer be contained, and the first shift after 23 years of dormancy would be violent. It was. The pain started in her spine and radiated outward like cracks spreading through ice, and she dropped to her knees on the cold stone, and her vision split the world, doubling human sight overlaid with something sharper, more saturated, threaded with silver. She could hear her own bones rearranging a sound like green wood bending, and she screamed, and the scream became a howl halfway through the frequency, dropping from human register into something older and wilder. Kyle was there. He had been there before she fell, as if he had known, and he was on his knees beside her, with his hands hovering over her body, not touching, because Maren had warned him that touch during a first shift could redirect the transformation and cause injury. His wolf was at the surface, his eyes full gold, and he was growling not at her, but at the pain, as if he could intimidate it into stopping. The shift completed in 90 seconds that felt like 90 years. When it was over, Ilara was standing on 4 legs, and the world was a cathedral of scent and sound, and her wolf was enormous. Not just large, enormous. White gold fur that caught the starlight and threw it back. Shoulders as high as Kyle's chest, eyes that were no longer brown but a deep, burning amber that matched his. The Blackmoor wolves in the courtyard went silent. 20 wolves, hardened warriors, staring at her with expressions that ranged from shock to something that looked suspiciously like reverence. Ashwood Marin whispered from the colonnade, where she was leaning against a pillar with a blanket around her shoulders and a look of profound satisfaction on her ancient face. The true bloodline. I had forgotten how magnificent they were. Kyle shifted. He did not strip first, which meant his clothing tore off him in shreds that scattered across the courtyard, and the wolf that replaced him was black as a moonless night, massive, scarred across the flank, where a blade had once caught him, with amber eyes that blazed like twin furnaces. He was the largest wolf Ilara had ever seen. She was larger. He circled her. She circled him. The courtyard held its breath. Their noses touched, and the contact sent a pulse through the bond so powerful that every wolf in the courtyard felt it a shockwave of recognition that made the younger wolves whimper and the older ones lower their heads. Then Kyle did something that no one in Blackmoor had ever seen the Alpha King do. He lowered his head beneath hers. It was not submission. An Alpha King doesn't submit. It was acknowledgement, recognition of an equal. A wolf bowing to the other half of its soul. Ilara pressed her muzzle to the top of his head, and the bond between them sang a frequency that was not sound, but something deeper. Something that lived in the marrow and the blood and the ancient preverbal part of the brain, where wolves and humans had not yet diverged. They ran. Out through the gates, down the mountain, through the black pine forest, where the frost turned the needles to silver and their paws struck the frozen earth in synchronized rhythm. They ran until the keep was a distant cluster of lights on the mountainside, and then they ran farther into the wild territory, where no pack held claim, and the moon came out from behind the clouds and lit the valley in cold white fire. And they ran, and they ran. And for the first time in Ilara's life, she was not running away from something. She was running toward it. They returned at dawn. Ilara shifted back in the courtyard, and Brigid was waiting with a cloak, and Fen was in his cradle by the great hall's fireplace, and the keep was warm and smelled like bread baking, and wood smoke, and home. Kyle shifted beside her. Someone handed him trousers. He looked at Ilara standing in the dawn light, with her white gold hair tangled, and her skin flushed from the cold, and her wolf gleaming behind her eyes, and his expression was open in a way she had never seen before, stripped of every defense. "Raw, now," she said. He blinked. "I know who I am now," she said. "And I choose this. I choose you. Mark me." The marking ceremony took place 3 days later, not because there was any doubt, but because Brigid insisted on proper preparation, and Brigid Ilara had learned was not a woman you argued with about ceremony. The great hall was filled with the Blackmoor pack, every wolf from the most senior warrior to the youngest pup, and the hall smelled like pine boughs and beeswax candles, and the roasted venison that Ronan had been preparing since the previous evening, with what Ilara suspected was a juniper berry ratio approximately 3 times higher than any recipe called for. Lysara stood at the front in her capacity as chief advisor, and when Ilara walked to the center of the hall, Lysara inclined her head. Not much, but enough. And later, when the ceremony was over, Lysara would be the one to hand Ilara the formal ledger of the Blackmoor pack and say, "I believe you will want to review these. There are inefficiencies in our trade documentation that have been bothering me for years, and I suspect you are the only person in this territory who will understand why." It was Ilara thought the most Lysara compliment she would ever receive. She treasured it. The marking itself was simple, ancient. Cale stood before her in the firelight, and his eyes were gold, and his wolf was at the surface. And he said the words that alphas had said for 1,000 years, words so old they predated the common tongue words that meant, roughly, I claim you as my equal, my other, my always. Then he placed his mouth on the junction of her neck and shoulder, and bit down. The pain was sharp and immediate, and then gone, replaced by a heat that spread from the mark through her entire body like sunlight through water. And the bond between them, which had been a humming thread since the moment she crossed his border, became a river wide and deep and permanent, and she could feel him, not just his presence, but his emotions, his thoughts. The vast or complicated interior of a man who had been alone for 11 years and was no longer alone, and was so grateful that it registered in her chest as a physical ache. She bit him back. He had not expected it. His eyes widened, and then he laughed, a real laugh, low and warm and startled, and the pack erupted into howls that shook the timbers of the great hall, and Bridget wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, and Ronan burned the bread, because he was watching instead of tending the oven, and Fen in Maren's arms watched the proceedings with those vivid green eyes, and made a sound that might have been a laugh, that evening after the celebration had wound down and the pack had dispersed, and the great hall smelled like cold candle wax and pine resin, and the remnants of the feast, Cale and Elara sat on the floor of their room, with Fen between them. The fire was low. The keep was quiet. Kyle was holding Fen on his knee, supporting the infant's head with one massive hand, while Fen gripped his index finger with both fists. The pup's green eyes were fixed on Cale's face, with the intense, unblinking focus of the very young. The council will need to appoint an alpha for Grey March, Kyle said. Fen is the legitimate heir, but he is an infant. They will install a regent, I know, Elara said. If the Ashwood line is formally recognized, which it will be now that you have shifted, you have a claim to the northern territories that predates every pack here, including mine. I know that too. He looked at her. Does that concern you? She leaned her head against his shoulder. The bond hummed between them, a warm, constant frequency, like a tuning fork struck and never damped. I spent 23 years in a closet. I do not want a territory. I want to raise this child in a place where he will never be a loose end. I want to reorganize your trade ledgers because Lysara is right. They are a mess. I want to eat Ronan's stew and argue with Bridget about whether Fen's blankets are warm enough and run through the valley at night with you until my legs give out. She looked at Fen, who had fallen asleep, with his face pressed against Kyle's chest, his breath making small, warm patches on the fabric. I want mornings, she said. Quiet ones, where no one is afraid. Kyle pressed his lips to her hair. His arm tightened around her shoulders. Outside, the wind moved through the black pines, and the moon hung over the valley like a lantern, and somewhere in the corridors of the keep, Bridget was already setting out the breakfast trays for morning, the bone broth, the soft bread, the small jar of wildflower honey with the hand-written label. The fire settled in the grate with a soft, collapsing sound, and Fen's fingers loosened in sleep, releasing Kyle's hand. And Kyle did not pull away. He stayed exactly where he was, his palm open under the infant's curled fists, and the mark on his neck glowed faintly in the dying light, and the mark on Elara's neck answered it, pulse for pulse, a rhythm older than language. The last log in the fireplace split and sent a shower of sparks upward into the dark chimney, and one of them caught the edge of the wooden wolf mobile above the cradle, and made it spin slowly, casting small moving shadows on the timber ceiling. wolves chasing wolves in an endless gentle circle. Ilara closed her eyes. Her wolf settled. The room was warm,